For my art research project, I chose to do Titian, the painter of the Renaissance, who lived from 1488 to 1576. I chose Titian because he was a true child of the Renaissance. He was born in 1488 in Italy, where later he traveled at a young age. He traveled to Venice to study art. Titian is generally considered one of the best by historians and his colleagues as one of the greatest artists of the early Renaissance, known for his bold style, heavy use of color, and skill in doing portraits and making figures. He displays a style that has detailed drawings, masterful use of color, incredible detail, and realistic depictions of figures. He had three primary subject matters that he liked to paint, heavily focusing on religious matters, but he also did a lot of commissioned portraits, and he also had a time where he did a series of scenes from Greek mythology. On the right, we see a portrait of a lady. This was most likely a commission done by some aristocracy, and Bacchus and Adrian, which is a scene from the Metamorphoses depicting the god Bacchus. When concerned mediums, Titian worked almost exclusively in oil and canvas. The oils and canvas allow him to use a lot of pigments, giving him a lot of different hues within his works, which was relatively uncommon at the time, as a lot of people did not really have access to these kind of pigments to use in their art. He was known for his use of color, really, and as you can see on the right, with the Holy Family and a shepherd, you see the dress of Mary with the reds and blues and the skies behind. The rich and bright colors was a pretty unusual thing, as you typically got more muted colors because that was more accessible to artists of the day. Though he worked mainly in oils and canvas, he did attempt some printing. He would design woodcuts, but would not attempt to engrave them himself, and then would send those off to others to be engraved and then printed. Peers and influences. He was a painter of the early Renaissance, so of course his style is relatively reflective of the rest of the painters. It tended to be a very realistic type of thing, but also tended to have fantastical elements or a large scale. You had the implementation of like backgrounds and scenery. He was in the Venetian school during the Renaissance, which was one of the two kind of sects of painters that did work. His main influence in the development of his style, which you can see is a very similar style to his mentor, Giovanni Bellini. You can see the similarities between the two because Giovanni Bellini trained Titian. He became very reflective, but Titian definitely stood out in his later years because of his innovations in his work. And Titian, being contemporaries with other Renaissance painters, had kind of like friendly rivalries going with people like Michelangelo, they would work together and then comment on each other's art and kind of compete. You can even see later with Pieta that they did works that were very similar, and then they would kind of compare them between the two. This is probably my favorite one of Titian's works is Pieta. It's his last painting before he died, and he was unable to finish it. He had originally intended it to put over his grave, but being old and frail, he was unable to finish it, and it was later finished and put in a collection. It is filled with biblical figures and elements, which is reflective of the time, as many chose to do that, and especially Titian. But he put a darker, more serious light in it. We see the Mary holding Christ in her arms as he dies right in the middle of the painting, and the darker tones on the outside insinuate a lot of shadow. If you can see the figure on the right of Christ, that is supposedly Nicodemus, but Titian painted it as almost a self-portrait to kind of insert himself into the painting. This painting is called The Allegory of Prudence. The painting represented the different stages of growth and maturity The elderly man on the left is Titian's self. The one in the middle is supposedly Titian's son, and the one on the right is his nephew. These were all members of his family as they both trained under him and were very close to him during his life. The theme of the three heads and changing maturity is repeated on the lower half to bring balance in the animals. And there's much controversy really on the meaning of this, whether it's more focused on the maturity of age and the foolishness of youth, or if it's Titian commenting that even though he is old, he is still capable. Here we see Venus and Adonis, which was part of the series he did as a commission for Philip II. It's a break from Titian's typical religious art, focusing instead on mythology found in the Metamorphoses by Ovid. Many versions were made, each differing slightly, but the version on the right here is considered to be the final draft of the set. Many people under him worked on pieces that were similar, but this was Titian's kind of own thing, and he chose this one to kind of really put out there. It is painted to tell a story rather than teach a lesson or convey a moral or religious principle. Titian was a very famous painter of the time. He was widely commissioned. Everybody knew of him all over Europe. He was frequently commissioned by royalty to do paintings, portraits, and then paintings similar to what we see in Diana and Actaeon. He was regarded as one of the most talented and innovative artists of the Renaissance. He's dubbed the sun amidst small stars. He was respected and studied by many. In 1530, Titian was commissioned to paint a full-size portrait for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Because of his skill, he became the chief painter for the imperial court, which was a big deal. Gave him a lot of access to a lot of things, and even granted him a title or two along the way. Because of his relationship with the court, Titian would later become the personal painter for Spain's Philip II, producing works like Diana and Actaeon as a part of a series on Greek mythology that Philip II would keep himself. Titian's success was in large part attributed to his ability to show the true selves of those he painted and the skill of which he portrayed them. His importance and legacy, his portraits followed much of the history in terms of the ruling class as the progression and the passing on of leadership, as well as the aristocracy. It kind of gives his works a flow of history. His use of color inspired many following artists to experiment with color similarly. His sweeping and freeform brush movement helped cement his legacy, as many later, for centuries, attempted to emulate him and how he did his brushwork, and was able to use freeform brush movement to still create such vivid scenery and figures. Facts about his life. He was sent to Venice to study, living with his uncle at the age of 9, where he studied under Giovanni Bellini. When he died, he had many unfinished works in his workshop, which were taken over by those under him and other artists of the time, and finished and kind of contributed to both Titian and themselves. Titian's Crown of Thorns, as displayed on the right, is considered by a lot of people to be one of his greatest works, though there still remains some controversy, because, as you may know, art tends to be kind of a subjective thing, where one person, like I personally prefer Pita, but the Crown of Thorns here is a very technically appealing piece. He produced a large amount of commissioned and non-commissioned artworks, numbering at an estimated 400 pieces. Thank you for watching. This has been my presentation.